From the high desert of northern New Mexico, this is Circle for Original Thinking. I am your host, Glenn Aparicio Perry. Welcome to Circle for Original Thinking, America's electronic talking circle for visionary thinkers, an open forum for fresh ideas and timeless wisdom applied to today's political and ecological challenges. Each week, we bring together creative thinkers from a variety of different traditions. We ask the hard questions on the important issues of the day: political polarization, climate change, virulent viruses, and other symptoms of humanity being out of balance with the natural world. Our goal is to recreate a whole and sacred America, a new and improved version of E pluribus unum, from the many to the one, and this time not leave anybody out. Join us as we embark on this quest. With the advent of the nuclear age, Western science reached the pinnacle of invention but lacked a critical understanding of its underlying wisdom or purpose. Carl Jung framed the problem as modern man in search of a soul. When the Western mind turned outward searching for what was missing, it first turned to the East. A trickle of Eastern gurus soon became a flood. And by the late 1960s, all sorts of gurus, roshis, rinpoches, and other teachers were promising some form of mastery of life, if only one followed their path. Many Americans embarked upon this quest for spirituality, mostly in California and later across the nation. Our guests, Dan Millman and Ron Boyer, were at the forefront of the California movement. They not only embraced Eastern wisdom, they took an active part in remaking Western psychology, at the time mired in psychoanalysis and behaviorism, into a humanistic third force of psychology that expanded the discipline to include religion, spirituality, and self-actualization. Along the way, they discovered not only the benefits, but also the pitfalls of embarking on a spiritual path. This is their story. So welcome, Dan and Ron. I want to introduce you properly, but greetings. First, let's introduce Dan. Dan Millman, a former world trampoline champion, a Stanford University gymnastics coach, a martial arts instructor, Oberlin College professor, has authored 18 books published in 29 languages. Way of the Peaceful Warrior, after being republished by New World Library, became a mega bestseller and was adapted to film in 2006. Dan has traveled widely, teaching in over 30 countries. His most current book is Peaceful Heart, Warrior Spirit, which is the true story of his spiritual quest. To learn more about his books, events, online courses, and life purpose calculator, visit www.peacefulwarrior.com. Welcome, Dan. And now Ron Boyer, Ronald L. Boyer, M.A.D.D.I.V., Doctor of Divinity, a Jungian depth psychology protege and colleague of Dr. Stanley Krippner. He helped Stan create the original curriculum model for the Humanistic Psychology Institute, now Saybrook University, back in the early 70s. And he went on to become the director of the Sonoma Institute, the first accredited graduate training program in the nation for psychotherapists trained to the humanistic transpersonal framework. An award-winning poet, author, and screenwriter, Ron is also the director of the Krippner Institute for Indigenous Studies and currently a doctoral student in cultural and historical studies of religion at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. So, hello. Okay. How's everyone doing today?
Glad to be here.
Good to be here. Okay, we're going to start with a softball question. Well, I joke slightly. But I think it's safe to say that both of you have engaged in this spiritual path and have developed a fair bit of self-awareness along the way. But my first question for both of you is, where does awareness come from? Does awareness arise, or do we simply awaken to awareness that is already there?
Well,
Where does awareness come from?
Quite a question to begin with.
Yeah.
I have no idea. It remains a mystery, but in the beginning was awareness. I view that as who we ultimately are, the same consciousness or awareness shining through billions of eyes, and human and other creatures. And awareness, as we all know, changes moment to moment in each of us, the quality and the depth. So that's all I could say about that big question. Where does awareness come from? How about you, Ron?
Okay, Ron, you're on.
Yeah, the trickster is at work here, Glenn. Hardly a softball question. It leads us directly into the mystery of being and of existence, of consciousness itself, and of our fundamental nature as consciousness. And just the fact that we're here in a conscious form is, to me, one of the great, great miracles and mysteries of life. And the quest to understand that as the nature of our existence seems to me to be one of the fundamental and eternally unanswerable questions. And that questioning, for me, began with the zeitgeist of the 60s, where that search for the soul that had been lost, that you quoted from Jung, really began in mainstream culture. And there were many, many components to that. The lack of the ability of mainstream cultural traditions, basically Judeo-Christian religion, to be able to speak to those spiritual questions and needs. It was, a given faith or doctrine that we were enculturated in, rather than a radical questioning of reality and the nature of reality. And that was aided by many factors. I think for Dan and myself, the encounter with psychedelics was a piece of that. It opened our perception radically to a critique of the consensual reality that we'd been, raised to believe in. And out of that came a desire to understand our nature and the nature of reality in more depth. And that kind of was the beginning of the spiritual quest, looking for elders and spiritual teachers who might have some answers to those mysteries.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, in preparation for this interview, I ingested some mushrooms. I had some portobello and shiitake this morning with my omelet. so I find that actually any mushrooms can be very grounding.
Absolutely.
I remember having being actually since in Berkeley, California, with grandfather Leon Secatero, and going to a Chinese restaurant. And he was the softest, sweetest, mellifluous soul I knew. So he turned to the waiter and he just politely asked, "Can you please bring me a plate of mushrooms?" And that's what he did. Yeah, it was a good restaurant. So anyway, you started to get into your experience in the 60s and the 70s, and I appreciate that, because that is the kernel where we're going to go. So I'm wondering about your experiences with those various teachers, and I often think about the original meaning of teacher. It's from the Old English laren, which is the source of the modern learn and lore. So there's something about teachers to me that the original teachers were all storytellers, and they learned as much as they were disseminating knowledge while they were telling these stories. So I'm wondering about your teachers and mentors. We could talk a long time about that probably, but how have they helped you along the way? And how have they maybe hindered you, or, and what did you learn even from the mentors that may have disappointed you? Because I remember what Dan Moonhawk Alford told me, which is that you can learn from anyone, even if you only learn what is a bad example. So tell us a little bit about that story. Let's go back to Dan.
Okay, let me jump back. When I was emerging, perhaps pre-adolescence, because emerging from the soupy, dreamlike state of young childhood, I looked up and around, and one day it struck me. I went, most of us just put our nose to the grindstone, aim ahead, doing what we're supposed to do, what we've learned in our society, whatever that society may be. But I started asking myself, what is this all for? What is life about? What are the rules here? And that began a lifelong calling of collecting quotations. I was trying to find pithy wisdom based on the idea that nobody's smarter than all of us. So I found male and female voices. The first quote I ever came across was Ben Franklin, "A penny saved is a penny earned." And that seemed true to me. It seemed like valuable, practical advice. But then I came across a contradictory quote, "Nothing ventured, nothing gained." So I didn't know whether to risk or to save. And then I learned that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And there may be some truth in that, because, even when we shower, we probably go through the same turning, same direction, same routine. We have these fixed routines, and there's a danger of, when we get older, catching psychosclerosis, hardening of the attitudes. But yeah, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, except you're never too old to learn. Yeah. And then I came across the quote, "Birds of a feather flock together." Now that seemed true, except opposites attract. And absence makes the heart grow fonder, but out of sight, out of mind. And it was only when I came across this quotation that for the first time, we've all heard it, obviously, as a chain breaks at its weakest link, but I couldn't find anything to contradict it. And that was the first time I stumbled on what I would call spiritual law, a universal principle. And it's a law because it's consistent, it works every time, and it's universal. We also break at our weakest link: physical, emotional, mental, sexual, social, financial. So I was finding guidance in universal wisdom around the world from various people. But that's when that awareness just struck me. And we all agree awareness seems like a good thing, but it's not always pleasant. When we start seeing the shadow elements, and maybe Ron can address that. But so I wanted to jump back to that time rather than just going into the teachers we met as we were more or less grown adults. Yeah. And if I could add one more thing here. I was really into self-improvement. I mean, I took memory courses, speed reading, speed mathematics, word power made easy, sleight of hand, ventriloquism. I was into learning everything and anything I could to improve myself, which seems like a good thing. The better each of us is, it's better for the planet. But then one day, another kind of light bulb moment. It struck me that no matter how much I improved myself, only one person benefited. But if I could impact other people somehow, and I think that's a calling all three of us have, that made my life more meaningful. I didn't know how at the time that I might do that, but I think that commitment to share what I had learned with others, I think was the first calling to be a teacher of sorts. That's what I think opened me up to meeting in the odd ways I did, the 4 mentors over a 20-year period. And that's my prelude, if you will. And let me hand off to Ron.
Okay. Well, we're going to come back to you for the teachers.
Sure.
But yeah, we'll go to Ron. Thank you. That was good.
Great, Dan. just a quick note, when we get back to those teachers, I know Dan because of our shared experience with one of them. We met in San Francisco in 1975. And we can talk about that. Just a quick note, one of the things I appreciated about what you just shared, Dan, was the nature of paradox, and that it's possible. It reminds me of the maxim that it's possible for two opposite truths to exist at the same time, and that's one of the big lessons that I think we've all encountered in our lives. In terms of teachers, there are so many, because they begin, when we pop out, and our parents are our teachers, and then
Yes.
our family and the friends of the family, and the school systems we eventually enter, and so forth, and all of those combine to shape our awareness in our consciousness, in our view and perspective on the nature of reality and how we interpret it. For me, I also had a need from an early age to find my own answers. And those teachers came for me in the form of hard lessons, the school of hard knocks, and in the form of books, some of which I was introduced to in the course of, mainstream learning. But I think all of us probably have large libraries, and those books were our friends and still are, and that's why they're still on our bookshelves after, all of these years. We can still find a reflection of truths articulated in magnificent ways by immortals, literary immortals, from Shakespeare to whomever. So through that exposure to literature in various forms, I began to ask, larger questions, and to struggle to learn, apart from my public education. So that was really I think the beginning of teaching and the quest for me. It was a quest for knowledge that I wasn't being provided for by the collective culture, and that was an important part of my quest.
Okay, I'm going to go back to Dan. I just want to add this thread, because I know you like threads. So I want to add this thread. I mean, I was looking up the word guru, and I was interested to learn that the word guru, the Sanskrit word guru, comes from gu, which is darkness, and ru, which is light. And so I wonder if, while you're talking perhaps about some gurus that or teachers that have presented themselves as spiritual wisdom holders, how has that impacted you? I mean, how is you alluded to it before too, how has the shadow come into it, and how has it helped you formulate in your life what is truth?
Mm-hmm. Well, as we know, shadows are only possible in the presence of a light. So one goes with the other. And again, jumping back to this commitment to share with others, through an odd coincidence, a phone call I made to a friend who had, in my senior year at Berkeley, helped me step into the psychedelic experience one time, which was enough, which was really instrumental and formative in giving me a preview and a promise of possibility. So I gave him a call. I was a professor at that time at Oberlin, and I was doing a research grant, traveling around the world. And when I was in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, I gave him a call, and he said, Dan, I just completed this training. Drop everything if you can and do it. It was 40 days, 10 hours a day. And I believe Ron also took this same training at a different time. So we have that in common for one thing. Perhaps different experiences of it. But the man's name was Oscar Ichazo. Many people have heard of the Enneagram, for example, the various Enneagram books. Claudio Naranjo started a center in Berkeley. And he taught students who eventually taught Helen Palmer, the Enneagram author, and Stephen Riso. And many people attribute it to Gurdjieff or the Jesuits or the Sufis. But they now acknowledge, all the modern day Enneagram authors, that the source, the modern source of the depth Enneagram material is from Oscar Ichazo, who really brought it into the world. And he was the man I called the professor. And I acknowledge him. As Ron said, we all have mentors everywhere. You know that saying, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. We've all heard it. But I think many people misunderstand that, to think, and they believe that if they're somehow deserving enough, or they've suffered enough, or prepared enough, been initiated, then some teacher like Socrates will appear to kick them or guide them up the path. But I believe when the student is ready or paying attention, as you've hinted at before, the teacher appears everywhere. I learned a valuable lesson, a life-changing lesson, watching a cloud drift across the sky, watching trees bend in the wind. Nature has always been my primary teacher, and I think many people, including you, can relate to that. Mm-hmm. But when I exposed myself and I was able to do it, the circumstances allowed. How many people can do a 40-day training today? But at the time it was possible for us. This was early 70s. And it was see, I need to provide context. Otherwise, we're just jumping in with tunnel vision. First of all, this approach to living that I teach today, called the Peaceful Warrior's Way, and I can define that later if you wish, but a basic tenet is that there's no best teacher, no best book, no best philosophy or religion or diet or system of exercise. There's only the best for each of us at a given time of our life. Life is an experiment. We have to find out what works for us. So I'm not claiming my teachers were the best. However, they were heavy hitters. Oscar Ichazo, the professor, had a global heritage of spiritual technology. That you do these exercises, it leads to a more enlightened state. And that was his promise. And, Ron and I learned 30 different kinds of meditations for different purposes, and deep breath work. Anything you've heard of, probably we did in this training, including models of consciousness, levels of consciousness, doors of tension release, unconscious approaches to life. So it was a lot of shadow work as well as illuminating, inspiring type of material. But each of the four mentors that I worked with, and I relate in the new memoir, were a radically different approach to spirituality, to life. And they represent, though, the primary means people use. The professor was a technology approach. And today we see that. Meditation techniques are taught as a technology. You do the meditations, you get certain results. Avatar, NLP, EST, the old EST and the spin-offs, so Forum, LifeSpring. All these trainings are technology-oriented. Scientology, they have their Dianetics and their kind of thing too. So many different schools, that's one approach people do to grow, to develop themselves. And that was my experience in the school of the professor. Then I did advanced work later on. I became a teacher for Eureka. It was actually briefly at Berkeley Eureka House, Ron, on the corner of Ashby and Shattuck, I think it was. And I helped found that and paint the walls and put the carpets in and all that. But I ended up moving on. And I'm not going to go into why, but the point is, then I discovered the guru, radically different approach. Also, you had experience with him, known variously as Franklin Jones, Bubba Free-John, Da Free-John, Adi Da, so much. And he had the mojo. I mean, he really did. He attracted many people, including Ken Wilber. Alan Watts said, I've been looking for such a one my whole life. And so I wasn't alone. And Wilber had an incredible testimonial about him in an early book. But he said, I'd rather beat you with a stick than tell you to meditate your way to enlightenment. Because his approach was satsang, just sitting with him, having him transmit the divine that shone through him. And even though he had great teachings and wisdom, and he wrote many brilliant books, that was his approach, which is not technological. So those are the first two mentors, and I only mention them right now because I wrote Way of the Peaceful Warrior, inspired by my time, which was about 10 years with the professor and then the guru.
I see.
And that's when I wrote Way of the Peaceful Warrior. We can touch upon the other mentors if you like later, but I want to give Ron some airtime too.
Yeah, no, that's very good. And of course, your Way of the Peaceful Warrior introduces to us the partly fictional character Socrates. And we might talk about that a little bit more later. But sure. I wanted to turn it back to you, Ron, in particular, if you want to address that was a rather controversial figure, Bubba Free-John. And I don't know how much our audience knows about him, but it would be important to give some background. And then also, I want you to, at some point, I'd love for you to tell the story to us of how you met Stanley Krippner, because that's a great story and a great partnership that you've had. Go ahead.
Well, to back up a little bit from the guru, one of the reasons we're here is to give a plug to Dan's new memoir, which I've read in its entirety and learned so many things from that. Even having, met 45 years ago, I was not aware, for example, that Dan had any, contact with Eureka. And that was an experience that we've never discussed, but it is extremely relevant for both of us. Dan's a little bit older than me, so he was, my big brother there. He was ahead of the curve. Eureka was a very powerful training that I experienced also on the way to meet the same guru where we met. I took the 40-day Vermont advanced training, sold my Harley to be able to afford the tuition. and my new bride at that time, and while we were already, on our way to more traditional spiritual practices with the Soto tradition and the wonderful Soto Buddhist Zen teacher Dainin Katagiri Roshi, which was our interlude on the way to the West Coast. We bought a camper van and outfitted it with lots of granola and headed to Vermont for 40 days for an incredible summer there doing the Eureka trainings. And for people that want to learn more about that, Dan really describes it very well in his memoir. But
Thank you.
the way I found Oscar Ichazo in Arica, and I never met Oscar Ichazo, but found out about it is because I had encountered the teachings of Gurdjieff and Uspensky while I was in college, and was very, very impressed. And one of the things I was impressed by was Gurdjieff, devoting his life to studying the Eastern esoteric traditions and Mid-Eastern esoteric traditions, and he was an introduction to Sufism, for example, and through that and through my connection to Claudio Naranjo, who Dan mentioned, I found out about the Arica training, and that's why we attended it. It was a very powerful experience. As Dan said, it was all about technologies. We were, studying how the mind maps and all kinds of psychophysical exercises, and a generally healthy way of living. For me, that was a temporary stop on the way to Zen training, and then from there to the West Coast to get involved with Bubba Freejohn. One of the values for Bubba Freejohn, in terms of, to explore this concept of the shadow, which is very much a concept from depth psychology, particularly Carl Jung, is that we have unconscious factors affecting our conscious lives and bleeding into our conscious lives that can erupt as various irrational, perhaps even pathological phenomena in our lives. If our lives are really messed up, it's probably because of some unconscious psychological conditioning, probably stemming from early childhood parent dynamics. Sometime one of the hard lessons for me within the spiritual search, which tends by and large to ignore the shadow and think that enlightenment is seeing forms of light and positivity everywhere, rather than understanding some negative and destructive capabilities that are part of human nature and that we all suffer from. So for Jung, for example, the real spiritual work is understanding it from the perspective of self-knowledge and self-discovery, these unconscious factors that can really undermine our lives and cause great harm to others in the process. Bubba Freejohn was the guru in that sense of light and darkness very much. That was the paradox of his being, and one that's very hard to reconcile and can't be reconciled by the intellect. On one hand, as Dan said, he had extraordinary depth, brilliance, spontaneity, and for me and a lot of the people he attracted, a city or occult spiritual power that's attributed to many adepts in the Hindu tradition that was tangible. I experienced it as divine presence. Mm-hmm. And it was everywhere. It permeated his being in the world of the sanctuary where we went to see him. That was extremely alluring, addicting even. People wanted to feel that presence because it was like a divine realm. It was not of this world or felt like that, and was very palpable. And he had that ability to transmit that. On the other hand, as a human, and I think this is a key part of the lessons for me, as a human, he was not developed. He had extraordinary natural gifts, talents, brilliance, plus this city factor. On the one hand, at the same time, as a human, if you got to know him up close and personal, as I had the opportunity to do so, because I was part of his more intimate social circle, he was a maniac. He was maybe the most promiscuous human of our time. He was a total bad boy. He was extremely critical and demeaning of everyone around him. He used people. He exploited them for sex, for money, for everything, and for that reason, he gained a reputation as a sociopath, which I tend to agree with as an accurate psychological diagnosis. He was the Donald Trump of gurus, if that makes any sense.
Ron, let me just
Okay,
interject.
that was very good.
Go ahead.
Let me just interject that
Please.
One of our fellow community members, and I was there almost 8 years, he said he was a brilliant spiritual master who would have benefited from going through a 12-step program.
Absolutely.
So that's
absolutely.
Interesting.
So that was the shadow side. There was a light side that was brilliant and inspiring, and there was a shadow side that was highly destructive to most people around him.
Ronald, I'm going to need to jump in here. I'm going to have to get back to Stanley Krippner.
Sure.
That's part of the question, but I do want to come back to that. But I'm going to turn it over to Dan a little bit now, because with your new memoir, Peaceful Heart, Warrior Spirit, you've come clean about something that's been a big mystery to people who've been following your career for a long time, as to the character Socrates. And I think you probably avoided sharing exactly where that character came from, and maybe you don't even know in total where the character comes from. But it is a very interesting character. For those that haven't read the first book, that you meet the gas station attendant, or actually the service station attendant, right? Because he's in service. It's a very important distinction. And he becomes this pivotal character in your books. So how much was he based on these guru figures that were both shadow and light? And how much did he come in from something else, some kind of creative, from your creative imagination?
Sure, and I do take the opportunity to clarify all that, because I did leave it vague enough to be mysterious in the original book. And he is based on a cosmical guy I did meet in a service station on the corner of Oxford and Hearst in Berkeley, California. And he just reminded me of the ancient Greek sage, so I nicknamed him Socrates. I thought of him as that. But truly, I used that character years later. I said, I want to share what I learned, but I don't know how. So I'll just write an autobiographical type story, but I'll mix in some fiction for the sake of teachings and the sake of the story. So it blended both. And I think you can both relate. The whole idea in the metaphysical world of channeled beings, 20,000-year-old entities from another dimension, they speak through a human being and all that. My own view is it's depth psychology. My own view is that it's within the psyche of the person speaking, but they see it as a separate being that they're channeling. But I can see the value in it, because if I had written that book and just said, I'm Dan Millman, and here's what I have to share with you, I don't think I could have stepped into the big mind and big heart. But having this character like Socrates to say the wisdom, and me playing the adolescent student and often resistant student, I was able to really step beyond myself and transcend myself. So it gives me some empathy with these people, the so-called channels of various means of higher wisdom. And I was able to rise to the occasion through this character. So one way I put it in the book is Socrates is absolutely real. Dan Millman is a fictional character.
Well, I appreciate your sense of humor, and it's yeah, we're a verb, as Bucky Fuller used to say. So the nouning of Dan Millman, the nouning of Ronald Boyer are definitely fictional, because we're evolving, we're changing all the time.
Well, in a sense, I think Stanley Krippner, in a way, what is Ron's Socrates in some sense. Maybe I'm wrong about that, Ron.
Yes. Well, let's go back to that. Tell us the story. Go, please, right to it of how you.
Well, I want to, lean into Dan's creative process as an author here for a second, because he's touching on something that, from the view of depth psychology, Jung called active imagination. And Jung's Red Book, which has only been recently published, in the last decade, describes his creative process as an artist, which was the basis for his vast theories in depth psychology. And I would see Socrates from a Jungian lens as the self with a capital S, and the fiction of Dan Millman as, the self with a little s, the ego personality. And it's that self with a capital S that, speaking for myself, I made the mistake of projecting onto others, including Bubba Free-John. Mm-hmm. And I was looking to find in him what was already in me.
Mm-hmm.
And that I was projecting and giving my power to in an objective, externalized figure. Well, rather than owning it. So I just wanted to make that point.
Good, Ronald. That goes back to our first question. Where does awareness come from? So the awareness was already in you.
Yes.
Okay, good.
That capital S also refers to Superman or Stanley Krippner.
Yeah. And there's some comparison
Stanley,
there, not to project onto Stanley.
Stanley is not a young man. He's waiting for you
to carry out the metaphor. Stanley Krippner is definitely a fictional character, and one of our friends who's a novelist actually treated him as a fictional character in his novel. So there's some truth to that, which is all to say larger than life. I met Stanley, as I was becoming more self-aware as a college student. I had the great benefit of meeting one of the great pioneers in humanistic psychology. Marion Kinjay was her name. And it was through Marion Kinjay that I learned of the writings of Rollo May and Carl Rogers and Stanley Krippner and that whole crowd who were, working at Esalen, developing technologies for transformation that included and made room for teachers, coming from the East. Alan Watts was part of that circle also. I met Stanley, so I knew of Stanley's work by reputation, and when I made the move to come west, to move to San Francisco, it was with the intention of going from book learning by these mentors to live learning, to actually meet them, to dialogue with them, to participate in workshops and so forth. One day, while I was during the time that Dan and I were both in this spiritual community, I was sitting on a bench in San Rafael at the bus stop and wondering, what is my purpose from a vocational standpoint? Do I sell organic vegetables like I am now? Is that what I'm meant to be doing with other members of our community who were pioneers in natural foods? Or is there something more intended for me? I was a pretty young guy at this time. And as I was sitting there, this interesting looking man got off the bus and approached me, and he was carrying a big leather suitcase, and it had USSR Soviet Academy of Sciences bumper sticker on his bag, which immediately caught my attention because it was the height of the Cold War, and I didn't know that anyone from America had any contact with the Soviet Union. And when he sat down next to me, I couldn't help myself. I said, "Excuse me, but I noticed your sticker, blah, blah, blah." And he said, "Yeah, I'm just coming back from giving my keynote address to the Soviet Academy of Sciences." And so that got me going. And a number of other questions ensued. And then finally I said, "May I know your name?" And he said, "Stanley Krippner." Boom. Okay, you're one of the guys who I came all the way across country to meet at Esalen, wow. Right? Beautiful. And it went from, he was very, kind of closed. I would ask him a question and he'd give me a little bit. So what do you do for a living? "Well, I write and I teach." "Well, what do you write about?" "Oh, psychology." "Which branch of psychology? First force, second force, third force?" That got his attention. Yeah. Right? And he said, "Do you know about humanistic psychology?" And then it was, "Yes, I studied with Marion Kinjay at Michigan State." "Oh, Marion," because he knew her. Uh-huh. By the time we got up, my bus came, and he gave me his number. And my quest then, as I said, I really would love to write and teach about psychology. And he said, "Well, you have to get a PhD to do that. But here's my card. Give me a call. Give me your information." I was living in a household with our friends, Dan at that time, Terry Patton. Oh, yeah. And yes. Soon thereafter, I got a call. Terry said, "Hey, there's this guy, Dr. Stanley Krippner, on the line for you." And that began our relationship. Wow. And the rest is history. 45-year career, career and friendship and collegiality, starting when he hired me, actually gave me money to, write on psychology. So, wow.
Well, thank you.
Great story.
Thank you for that story, and thank you for the work you're doing with the Krippner Center for Indigenous Studies. I'm going to come back to you in a second, Ron, but we're near. Minutes are illusory. You understand? I mean, days are real, years are real. You know, everything else we're just trying to chop up something that's real, but in the podcast world, people believe in it more. But anyway, I'm going to come back to Dan, because I was very interested in the end of your book. I think it's in your new book, Peaceful Heart, Warrior Spirit. You talk about a realization that you had that first, mountains are mountains, rivers are rivers. Then after deep insight work, mountains are no longer just mountains, and rivers are no longer mere rivers, but rather profound and meaningful metaphors. But finally, at the end of your search, mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. I found that very profound, but I would like you to explain that a little bit to the audience, if you could, and in the context too of, was that the thread that kind of tied together your life story there? It's really very meaningful, but
yeah, it is reflective of my journey. A writer named Barbara Rasp once said, "The lesson is simple, the student is complicated." So I had to get through the complications. And after the guru, I worked with a man I called the warrior priest, very dramatic, very practical. He gave me really the tools for my calling. That's when I stepped forward and started teaching similar to what I do now, stepping out of the sports arena into everyday life skills, spiritual life skills, if you will. And finally, the sage, the fourth mentor, really brought me back to earth. And that was really back to mountains are mountains, rivers are rivers, and stop making it complicated. And by the way, he was a psychologist, an anthropological psychologist who graduated. One of his fellow graduate students at UCLA was named Carlos Castaneda. So they knew each other pretty well. And but he pointed out, based on his lineage, some aspects of reality and things we can control and can't control. And an approach to living which brings up the most important question that shapes our life, which is, what do I need to do right now? Back to the present moment, orientation, the moment of power, the moment of sanity. So that was back to mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. And represented a kind of completion. But after the professor and the guru, I wasn't looking for any new teachers. I felt I'd had the heavy hitters, and yet I found them anyway. First, the warrior priest, and through those circumstances, and then the sage, the man I called the sage, David K. Reynolds, PhD. He's still living up in Oregon. And yes, so I'm grateful to all the teachers. And one of the themes repeated throughout the book is that all teachers are human and all humans have flaws and foibles, including me. and in the sense that we're all students, we're all teachers. We teach by our example and we share what we can. So that's a pretty good way in the closing minutes I can summarize.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah. And thank you for that, Dan. Thank you. And so back to Ron, and in a few minutes, what is the it might have come from Stanley Krippner, but whatever it was on your journey, what is that thread that's tying together your life story that we can share with our audience?
Well, I think I share that with what you and Dan just discussed. And I was unaware of the sage in your work with him, Dan, but I was really delighted that your formal teaching lives and student life ended with that kind of approach to life. Which is a trajectory that went from ordinary life to extraordinary life, back to the integration of the two. as the extraordinary, ordinary life. And what you alluded to as one of the positive aspects of our encounter with Bubba Free-John was his teaching of divine ignorance, which was basically a deconstruction of ordinary consensual reality in the moment that brings us to the extraordinary mystery of life itself, and the renewal that comes from not taking anything for granted, whether it's carrying out the garbage or whatever. And I think the error of my youth was looking for a state of samadhi that was beyond anything I'd already experienced, and wanting that to be the permanent state of things, rather than understanding that awareness itself in every moment, in other words, being present, was what it's about. Being present with every moment of our lives, whether it's seems positive or whether it seems negative from a conventional standpoint. It all reflects reality as it is, and the sage helped bring that home for you. His teaching is very much informed by Japanese Zen Buddhist aesthetics and sensibility, which is all about understanding that the phenomenal world is in constant flux.
Beautiful.
Changing. Everything is appearing and disappearing. But in the midst of that, we can be aware in a non-judgmental way with what is. And if there's anything that I've got from this whole process, that's what it's about.
Now we're getting into Native America, but
yes.
When you start talking about flux, that's something I love to. That'll have to be another interview. But any last second thoughts, Dan? Because
last second, I often advise people to stop comparing themselves to other people. They're either going to feel superior or inferior. It's a profound disrespect for our own process. When I was a young coach, I found that some people learned somersaults quicker than others, but those who took longer to learn often learned them better than those who learned more quickly. So we need to respect our own approach to learning and to living, and that sense of self-trust, which Ron and I probably took a hit with the guru, we finally regained and stepped forward into life to share our truth in our own way of expression. So, and speaking of flux, my 2.5-year-old granddaughter just arrived, so I'm going to have to shift my priorities right now and go say hello to her.
Well, thank you for joining us. I'm just going to say a couple of closing comments, and then we're gonna wrap it up. But I really enjoyed this conversation. There's a lot of people I know that you guys also know, from Claudio Naranjo. I knew Dion Marks too. I used to be with her when she died prematurely, but also at the California Institute of Integral Studies. I just really enjoyed this deep dive. And sometimes it seems like the teachers that throw us off a little bit, they might confuse us, but it later on works in our benefit when we reintegrate things at a higher level. And I think you two both are shining examples of that. So there's really no bad teaching in a way if you appreciate that as everything as a blessing, and you learn in your own way, and you come to your own understanding, and it's so beautiful, as you're saying, Dan, to share that with other people, because they need to hear that and they need to find their own way. So this is really a great key. And I appreciate this so much. Thank you very much. This program is made possible in part by Select Books, Waterside Publications, BizGenix, and the Ecology Prime Media Channel. Producer and editor is Kanichi Sugihara. Native flute music by Orlando Secatero from the Pathways CD. Liberty Song by artist Ron Crowder, written by Ron Crowder, Jim Casey, and Danny Casey. The Circle for Original Thinking is a grassroots think tank whose mission is to seek out the deep origins of contemporary thought in order to remember and restore heart-centered wisdom for humanity and all our relations on Earth. This podcast is available on Select Books Inc. Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever podcasts are normally heard. For more information, go to originalthinking.us or originalpolitics.us, and you can also find and purchase my books, Original Thinking and Original Politics, there. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Ron, for coming on. And until next week, many blessings of good health and well-being to all. Thank you so much.